Test is Thursday the 17th. We'll be able to run through this in 3 classes, no problem at all. Yeah, we didn't have class last Thursday, just in case you checked your email before coming in. I tell you guys, you always check your email before coming to class. See if there's anything, important that's been announced or posted or, sent out via your email. In any case, we initially had 4 classes between tests. We'll have 3, just like we did for exam 1. So make your reservation. 250 of you already have in the 1336 classes that I have out of 750. And of course, you wait too long, you don't have a reservation, you're going to have to wait until there is space available. So we'll cover civil liberties. You'll read about the Texas Constitution. You'll read about local government, city, county, that kind of stuff. If we somehow have time, I'll talk a little bit about that in class as well. A lot of people are curious as to whether or not the syllabus quiz counts as extra credit. Yes, it does, just like it says in the syllabus. So if you take your extra credit quiz and your extra credit video quiz, if you take the syllabus quiz and the extra credit video quiz, and you add that to your score, then that's your score for exam 1. Of course, the syllabus quiz and the extra credit will continue to be divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but right now it's divided by 1. So everybody has an A right now. That will change. All right, so on this test in particular, court cases are going to make up the core of this test. That the last time it was, I think, pretty obvious about, powers and clauses and court cases. It was kind of a warm-up. Lots of court cases here. Okay, so that's what you focus on as far as the notes go. Already got the learning modules up and running for exam 2 instead of the weekend before, so that's good too. I believe the average, I don't want to speak out of turn. I think the average was 71 on the first test. And so then when you add in the extra credit, everybody's happy. All right. So, okay. And it says 1337 notes over civil liberties. It should say 1336, but I can't change that. I can't edit it because Windows 7 won't let me. Because it was downloaded from the internet and it might not be safe. And so you can go in and adjust that if you have administrator privileges, which I don't have because they're afraid I'm going to download pornography onto the hard drive again. So, it's ridiculous. You have to make several phone calls to get somebody to come in here to make it okay for you to edit your own notes as you go over them in class. Unless, I guess, I brought the flash drive, but I was also told not to flash anymore either, so. In any case, just sickened 3/4 of the class. They're sick now. Okay, what is, and the other quarter's intrigued, what is a civil liberty? This is not defined in the Constitution. It doesn't say what is or is not a protected right as far as civil liberties goes. Liberty is a concept that has been adjusted over time based on changing values in society. The term liberty and right are often used interchangeably. Technically, a civil liberty usually refers to a political freedom, and a civil right usually refers to equality under the law. Civil liberties are often controversial because they often involve less than a majority of the citizens doing something that a majority of citizens disapprove of. Often the argument goes, as this little old lady tried to explain to me out in Tomball back in 2004. Often the argument goes that since a majority of people are against what this political minority is doing, and since we live in a democracy where the majority is supposed to rule, therefore the majority should be able to triumph over the minority. And if the majority of Americans don't want this person doing this thing, they should not be allowed to do this thing. This is an inherently conservative argument. Conservatism, based most closely on philosopher Thomas Hobbes, adheres to the principle that the rights of society should outweigh the rights of the individuals whenever there is a conflict between the two. that if push comes to shove, you go with the majority. You go with the authorities and do whatever the authorities tell you to do. Now, what's wrong with this Hobbesian argument? Well, the adverse view is the liberal or Lockean view that people have a right to do X, Y, or Z individually or as a small group, unless it is specifically prohibited in writing. Hamilton makes it abundantly clear in Federalist Paper number 78 that elected politicians may incite the majority to infringe on the rights of individuals, much as the Founding Fathers did during the Revolutionary War against Tories and other folks opposed to the Revolution. And that an appointed judiciary is the best guardian of individual rights, not the legislatures, not the executives, but courts are going to be the best protector of individual rights. Thus, the term liberal democracy is often applied to countries like the United States, where majority rule is balanced with legal protection for minority rights. Arguably, the most important of these minority rights is the right to publicly oppose governmental policies without them sending in the tanks. Policies presumably enacted by and for the benefit of political majorities. Throughout American history, the country's greatest abuses have come as a result of unchecked majority rule rather than unchecked individual rights. For example, the Mill Massacre of 1838. Mormons came to believe that Independence, Missouri is where the Garden of Eden will descend and reappear on earth someday. And so they start moving into Missouri in big numbers. But the Mormons would only trade with each other, sell with each other, kind of a thing. They had their own little kind of economic guild going on. The other folks in Missouri didn't like that. And so the governor of Missouri puts out a death warrant on every dead Mormon man, woman, and child whose lifeless corpse couldn't be stacked into a pile of the state capitol building is worth a couple of bucks. And so God-fearing Christian Missourians went all throughout the state and slaughtered and killed as many Mormons as they possibly could, because that's what Jesus would want them to do, and stack their bodies on the state capitol steps. One of just a couple of religious wars involving the Mormons in American history. And so usually individuals doing their own thing isn't really what causes as much harm as the government and the majority of people coming in and killing a bunch of Mormons, or like in the Tulsa riots of 1927, wiping out much of the black community of Tulsa and then trying to cover it up for half a century because they had basically just discovered oil in the black section of Tulsa and they were all about to get rich, and now they're dead. They're not going to get rich now. That kind of a thing. Additionally, the national majority does not have unlimited rights under the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 lays out powers that are denied to Congress. Paragraphs 2 and 3 state, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law may be passed. So there are prohibitions against majority rule in the Constitution even before the Bill of Rights was written. A prohibition against the authority of Congress is a prohibition against the will of the majority of Americans. These are things Congress cannot do even if a majority of people elect people to Congress wanting to do it. The same can be said for the states. Article 1, Section 10 lays out the limitations on the will of the majority of states. Paragraph 1 prohibits states from passing any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or any law impairing the obligation of a contract. And so there are even restrictions upon state governments in the Constitution as well. In addition to that, almost every state restricted itself with a written constitution. A couple were still operating under their old English charters for a while. And all except South Carolina had a Bill of Rights listed at the front of their Constitution. Preamble, Bill of Rights, structure of the government, in that order. The purpose of the Bill of Rights is to place limits on the rights of the majority. When you talk about limited government, you're talking about limiting what a majority of people can do. That's what limited government is, limiting what the majority of people can do to minorities. Additionally, the language used in the United States and state constitutions contain an assumption of freedom or perhaps an assumption of privacy. That means that when you look, for example, at what is in the state constitutions from the time the state Bill of Rights, a couple of which I have in the notes, are written with ought language. The word shall appears nowhere, but the word ought appears everywhere in the state Bill of Rights. Now, when I tell you that you shall not do something or that you ought not to do something, we understand that ought is looser. Ought means if you can keep from it. It implies there may be a reasonable exception. You shouldn't do that. You ought not to do that. Or if you're a coach, no, yes, because he made a three-pointer, shouldn't have shot, that kind of thing. So you get the idea. Shall is like never, under any circumstances. You can't do this, period. No matter how good-looking the horse may be. So, once again, South Carolina comes kind of playing into that as well. Because there's a guy in South Carolina last year that got convicted for having sex with a horse. It was his second conviction for having sex with a horse, the same horse. So at least it's a monogamous relationship, So in any case, that in many of the textbooks, their American government textbooks, they argue, the founding fathers really didn't think much when they wrote the language in the Bill of Rights. And that's why you had the courts come in to correct the language or to clarify the language over the years. No, Congress was thinking pretty hard about what the language meant. The language is very different than what you find in the State Bill of Rights. If one were to propose a thesis, like Dr. Palmer at the law school, who also teaches history, does, that the Bill of Rights does not establish rights for U.S. citizens, but rather establishes a list of thou shalt nots directed against the United States government, does the language below support that thesis? And of course the answer is yes. Amendment 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, etc., etc., etc. They make it pretty clear that Congress can't do this. It doesn't say Congress in the states, it just says Congress. That in fact, Madison wanted to take the Bill of Rights and cut and paste it, so to speak, into Section 1, Article 9 of the Constitution, which is entitled Powers Prohibited to Congress. But Congress went against him on that, which is probably a good thing. Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed by who? The federal government. Amendment 3, no soldier shall be kept in any house without permission of the owner. Well, guess what? Most state militias were volunteer. You're not going to kick them out of their own house, are you? You're talking federal troops. Amendment 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause. Well, again, the word shall shows up, and they don't list any exceptions. They don't list any exceptions. They do not list under what circumstances can the police do a search without a search warrant and still use that in court against you. Of course, as we will learn, there are at least a dozen exceptions that allow the police to search your house without a warrant and still use it in court against you. But if you actually read the Constitution, there aren't any exceptions listed. And they don't define unreasonable either. The whole idea, well, let's interpret the law as written. Let's just say what it means is what it says. Really? What's unreasonable? Do they define unreasonable in the Constitution? Is it defined here? If it is, it would indicate that any search without a search warrant is an unreasonable search. That's about the only interpretation that you could actually get to if you're not going to add anything else into it. So it also says, it does not say that the people now have a right to be secure. It says the right to the people as if this right was already existing. They recognizing that these rights are not established by the Bill of Rights, but are recognized as the Bill of Rights, in the Bill of Rights. That the government is recognizing rights that people already have in the Bill of Rights. Amendment 5, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime. Once again, death penalty, constitutional. A capital offense means you're going to get killed for what you have done. And so they anticipated that states and the federal government would kill people from time to time. And so they wanted to make sure that they had it in there. So death penalty, constitutional, as it turns out. And unless on presentment of a grand jury accepting cases in the military, nor shall any person be put twice in jeopardy for the same offense, nor shall be compelled to be a witness against himself in criminal court, nor be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Once again, deprived of life, death penalty. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now here, we're talking about the federal government depriving people of life, liberty, and property. We're not talking about the states. State governments aren't mentioned here. And that's the way it stood for the longest time. That's what the paragraph basically says. Amendment 6 does establish 4 positive rights. Here they are saying the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. They're establishing the right to a speedy and public trial. And the trial has to take place in the districts which shall have been previously ascertained by law. You will have the right to be confronted with witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses, subpoenas, in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel. So they are establishing 4 positive rights here in the Sixth Amendment for people accused of crimes. Don't let anybody tell you that criminals don't have rights, because the only rights established in the Bill of Rights for individuals are rights of criminal defendants. Seventh Amendment is one of the unincorporated amendments. The Second Amendment got incorporated last year, and I would edit that if Windows 7 would only let me. But in any case, the Third, Seventh, and 10th Amendments still do not apply to the states. And so we're going to pretty much ignore 3, 7, and 10. These are what are called unincorporated amendments. Amendment 8, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Who is it that is prohibited from inflicting cruel punishment or imposing excessive fines or bail? Again, the federal government. Does not mention the states. Does not mention the states. Amendment 9 is a pretty vaguely written amendment. We'll come back to it. It lends itself to a variety of interpretations, is the best way to say it. What the Ninth Amendment means depends who you ask as to what it means. I've heard all sorts of different interpretations of it from all sorts of different people. That the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be denied, construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Does this mean that citizens have more rights than those listed in the Bill of Rights? Or does it mean that states have more rights than those listed? What are they talking about here in the Ninth Amendment? Which is still kind of weird. We'll get to that. 10th Amendment is supposed to limit the power of the federal government. Yeah, good thing that's in there. Because otherwise the federal government might be like way too big and out of control and spending a lot of money. And wow, it's... Okay. All right. Is the language in the Bill of Rights an accident of history? Most likely not. Because when you look at the Bill of Rights for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, or state of Pennsylvania, I should say, when you look at, and there it is, and when you look at the Bill of Rights for Virginia, also written about the same time, what you find is there's not a lot of shalls, but there's a lot of oughts. That the language is starkly different. They talk about how you ought not to deny people their rights. You ought not to do this. You ought not to do that. But it also talks about the responsibilities of the citizens. Like citizens are to be well informed as to who is running for office so that they can elect the people of the highest possible caliber. Which means, I guess, you're not supposed to watch Glenn Beck. So, and so it lists the rights of the citizens and says that these rights ought not to be denied or ought not to be granted to the government, in this case, that they use the word ought all throughout here. The difference in the language in the U.S. Bill of Rights indicates a deliberate intent, at the very least. The U.S. Bill of Rights was intended to restrict the actions of the United States government and not the states. At the most extreme interpretation, the Bill of Rights established protections for states the people as a collective, and not for individuals. Either way, the Bill of Rights was not intended as a restriction on the state governments. No doubt about that. The original intent of the Founding Fathers was that state government should be able to treat people as they see fit. The federal government, on the other hand, is restricted as to how they can treat people. That's how the court ruled in Barron versus Baltimore, the case we covered on Exam 1. That the U.S. Bill of Rights only restricts the actions of the United States government. It does not restrict the actions of the states. Now, this changes after the Civil War because of the 14th Amendment. And by 1925, the Supreme Court decides, you know what? Your rights as an American citizen should not vary that much from state to state. That there are certain fundamental rights that all states should recognize, whether they want to or not. It's not until 1925 that the Supreme Court decides that your rights as an American citizen should be pretty much uniform, regardless of what state you happen to live in. So you see, civil liberties and the rights that you have are a function of the relationship between the federal government and the states. The Founding Fathers believed that by keeping state governments powerful, this would protect the rights of citizens. And that to erode the power of states would be to erode the rights of the citizens. Well, guess what? If you're talking about the citizens being white, male, Christian property owners, then they're absolutely correct. But that has not been the definition of the people now for about a century and a half. The definition of the people is basically everybody. Everybody. Non-white, non-male, and as incredible as it may seem, non-Christian, non-property owners are also citizens, thanks to the Civil War. And so by weakening the power of state government, you have increased the power of individuals. The opposite of what the Founding Fathers thought was going to happen. That as the state powers have been diminished, individual powers have increased. That as restrictions on state governments are imposed, people get more freedom. Usually in the 1950s and the 1960s. We'll get to those cases. Now, the problem with the Bill of Rights as written, if it was taken literally, that would mean there could be no exceptions, no matter how reasonable, to rights listed in the Bill of Rights. You could yell fire falsely in a movie theater. You could commit libel without sanction. You could engage in sedition routinely. And there would be no way to stop any of that. And so interpreting the Bill of Rights as written resulted in people having relatively few rights and being pretty much victim to state majorities. But once the Supreme Court in the 20th century decided to abandon original intent and to abandon strict construction of the Constitution, suddenly individual rights start popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. In other words, we enjoy most of the freedoms that we have today not because of the original intent of the Founding Fathers, but despite the original intent of the Founding Fathers. That they weren't nearly as much into freedom as has been advertised. They weren't quite as far into individual rights as advertised, in part because their definition of who should have these rights was about 10 to 80% of the population, depending upon the state. White, male, Christian property owners. These were the people that they were looking to protect in the Constitution. They weren't looking to protect Indians. They weren't looking to protect blacks. They weren't looking to protect slaves. They weren't looking to protect women. Most of the people in this country. They were looking to protect themselves. They were looking to protect themselves. That's about to become illegal in Tennessee. I'm not going to be able to say that in Tennessee. They're trying to make it illegal to say anything bad about the Founding Fathers in Tennessee. Define bad. Benjamin Franklin's fat. Do I go to jail now? Okay. That is no accident that most of the great civil liberties cases that expanded individual freedom came after the court-packing plan of the 1930s and the abandonment of dual federalist ideology. strengthening the power of the federal government enhanced individual rights by restricting the power of the states from the 1930s to the 1990s. This is the opposite of what the Founding Fathers thought would happen. They believed the states would protect individual rights better than the feds, and it turned out to be wrong. Interestingly, since Lopez in 95, the case we talked about at the end of Exam 1, the states have generally expanded rights beyond the point where the feds are willing to go. For example, legalizing gay marriage. There's at least half a dozen states now that have legalized gay marriage. There's at least half a dozen countries in the Western Hemisphere that have legalized gay marriage. Most of the European countries have legalized gay marriage. And so today the states in many cases are actually expanding individual rights, and the federal government's the one that's kind of holding them back a little bit. Now, the incorporation of the Bill of Rights, incorporation, a term you're going to need to know for the test, incorporation refers to taking a prohibition against federal power in the Bill of Rights and applying it to restrict the powers of state governments. The first time this happened was in the case of Gitlow versus New York in 1925. This is the first time in American history where the United States Supreme Court said, you know what? The right to free speech is so basic and fundamental that you should have the right to free speech no matter what state you live in. Because as it turns out, the Constitution of the state of New York did not protect free speech. The ability to criticize the government publicly without going to jail, by the way, that's what free speech is. In this instance, incorporation means that a right has been determined to be so fundamental that no government at any level may violate it without good reason. It is ultimately up to the Supreme Court to determine whether a state or the feds have good reason to deny somebody their rights. So yes, government can deny you basic fundamental rights, but they've got to have a good reason for it. They have to have a good reason for it, at least theoretically. What we will find appallingly is many times rights have been restricted without very much of a good reason. Selective part of this selective incorporation means the court will consider on a case-by-case basis what is a fundamental right and what is not. That rather than taking all of the Bill of Rights and having it apply to all of the states back in 1925, the court said, well, we'll look at these one-on-one. Sometimes we'll rule that this is a fundamental right, and sometimes we won't. It's just going to depend. Being listed in the Bill of Rights alone does not necessarily mean the court will consider it a fundamental right, and not being listed in the Bill of Rights does not mean the court will not consider it a fundamental right. That the court has sometimes gone beyond the language of the Bill of Rights and ignored it completely at other times. The huge irony in all this is that the Bill of Rights was originally added to protect the states against intrusion by the federal government. And instead now the Bill of Rights is invoked to stop the states from intruding on the rights of people, and the people intruding is the federal government. That the federal government intrudes on states' rights to protect the rights of the citizens living in those states. That's the part that Rick Perry doesn't talk about. He talks about federal encroachment, but he doesn't talk about how federal encroachment has resulted in more freedom for individuals, more empowerment of individuals than at any point in the entire history of the United States. We enjoy a great deal more freedom today than we did 50 years ago, thanks to the court's willingness to abandon the original intent of the framers, like I already said. Okay, what the textbook does is list important cases and precedents, but you don't have to read those chapters. You are going to read the chapter on the Texas Constitution. You're going to read the chapter on state and local government. Okay, so first off, no right or liberty is absolute. That if the government has a good reason to lock you up and not give you an attorney, they can do it. If the government has a good reason not to allow you to publish something, they can stop you from publishing something. If the government has a good reason not to allow you to worship, they can prevent you from worshiping. So they just have to have a good reason. Every right or liberty is balanced by the compelling interest of the state or government to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens, which is why you cannot falsely yell fire at a crowded movie theater or have your kids spend the night at this guy's house. I really need to update the notes is basically what I'm saying here, because now it's not such a bad thing. The little alarm outside his bedroom that tells you when an adult is coming, I think that doesn't work anymore. For study purposes, focus on overlap, except that you don't read the Civil Liberties chapter, so forget about that too. First Amendment rights. It's good to come to class. First Amendment rights, starting with free speech. Perhaps the most important freedom in the Constitution is the right to free speech. Now, free speech means being able to criticize the government without sanction. Being able to criticize the government without sanction. When somebody goes out there and says something horribly racist or sexist or intolerant, and then people criticize it, people are like, oh, you can't do that. You can't criticize him. That's First Amendment. Okay, no. First Amendment does not prohibit us from criticizing people for saying stupid shit. In fact, that itself is covered under the First Amendment. It protects us from criticizing the government without any bad side effects, like incarceration or perhaps losing your job, unless, of course, you work at Lone Star College, and that's a different story entirely. All right. That there are so many different ways that people can express themselves politically that I and others, this isn't my classification scheme, this is somebody else's, has broken down free speech into 4 types of speech. Seditious speech, which has historically been the least protected. Pure speech, which has traditionally been the most. Speech plus conduct, which is kind of in between. Same thing with symbolic speech. Starting with seditious speech. Seditious speech occurs when somebody advocates violent action be taken against the government. Violent action be taken. For most of the 20th century, the big case was the 1919 case of Schenck versus the United States, where Schenck was a socialist who opposed U.S. entry into World War I. He makes a speech outside of the draft board where men are reporting for duty and tells them that you're going to war to protect American banks who have loaned money to the British and the French. And if the British and the French lose the war, as they were doing at the moment, then they might not pay, they're going to default on all these loans. And then all these banks are going to lose their money. And of course, the federal government's not going to come in and bail out the banks, because that's just something the federal government just isn't supposed to do. And if banks fail, you're on your own. But, okay. So he is arrested and convicted because at the end of his speech he had a call to arms. He said, hey, let's go to Washington and kick some ass. Okay, that's not what he said, but that's the idea. And the Supreme Court upheld his conviction. They said, yeah, you can't say that. You can't say that. Your speech comprised or composed or whatever a clear and present danger. Your speech presented a clear and present danger to the government because there was a call to arms, and the government doesn't actually have to wait till somebody takes their gun and starts marching to stop this from happening. They can take preemptive action if they need to. That Schenck's defense was, I didn't see anyone marching on Washington. I didn't see anybody not reporting for duty. That kind of a thing. No harm, no foul, right? Supreme Court said, nope. If there is a possibility. Okay, Abrams was ignored by the court, and I have often considered removing this because Abrams was a decision that the court itself ignored almost immediately after they wrote it because they were embarrassed. In Abrams, what happens is after World War I had ended, at least Schenck was making a speech during the war. World War I is over. We have tens of thousands of American troops in the Soviet Union trying to overthrow the communist regime there. How did that work out? And this is in the papers. 2 American socialists are opposed to this. They think that the troops should come home, so they write up pamphlets, and they basically throw them out of these windows of these apartments in New York, and they float it to the ground and basically say, call your congressman, tell them to pull the troops out of Russia. They're arrested and charged and convicted of sedition, even though there is no call to arms. There is no shoot your congressman. There was write your congressman, though. And of course, I guess the pen is mightier than the sword, so okay. In any case, the court here said, look, if you make a speech or print something up and as a result somebody reads that and becomes less patriotic, you can go to prison for it. It's called the bad tendency doctrine. Bad tendency doctrine. But then, once our communist scare was over by 1923, people looked back on this and went, you know what? we went a little bit nuts back there in 1919. Let's just kind of ignore that. Let's not talk of this again. We'll enforce clear and present danger, but we're going to ignore bad tendency because, shit, we're on the Supreme Court. Every day we say 3 or 4 things that might make people less patriotic, as it turns out. So, like listening to Christine Aguilera sing, that kind of thing. You might want to rehearse. That was the case until Brandenburg in 1969 puts into effect the incitement standard, which is still the standard today. Under the incitement standard, you can say anything you want to say as long as you are not in a position to carry it out. So you can say, I wish somebody would shoot the president, but you cannot say that if the president's on campus. You cannot email it to him either. I had a student back in the 90s that emailed a death threat to President Clinton, and the Secret Service found him because he signed into a lab and checked into a computer and then sent an email to the White House threatening to kill the president, and then was amazed to discover email has an address. It tells you where it was sent, when it was sent, and on what computer. It took them about 10 minutes to find out who sent the damn thing. Ay. But at least he knew that when it says in the syllabus there's no classes on the days of test, that there are no classes on the days of test. I had somebody write me last week to ask me if that's what that means. It says in the syllabus that we don't have lecture on class days. Does that mean that we don't meet? Next time I'll try to make it a little bit more clearer. All right. So you can say anything you want as long as you're not in a position to carry it out. You can say, geez, I wish somebody would burn down the White House. You just can't say it when you're at the White House. That kind of a thing. You have to proximity. You have to be in a position to carry it out. You can make a joke about having a bomb in your pants at the comedy club. You can't make that same joke at the airport. There's a guy 2 days after 9/11 was getting on a plane here in Houston. And he'd been stuck here for a couple of days trying to get somewhere. When he was going on there, they asked him what was in his bag, and he said, a bomb, okay? Yeah, he didn't make his flight. So, my wife works for TSA, the screener in Terminal C. She's got stories. Man, they find loaded guns all the time, knives all the time. And yes, there are people trying to smuggle bomb components onto planes. That they find this all over the place. That they're still testing the system. They're trying to get bombs onto the planes. So far, they haven't succeeded, nor are they likely to. On the other hand, it just takes one. So they have actually found this shit, but I'm not supposed to tell you that. So you didn't hear it from me. This doesn't work anymore. Okay. Get low was the first time anybody won a free speech case 6 years later. Until 1925, every time somebody alleged that their free speech rights were violated, they lost. Every damn time. Pure speech. I have gotten into more trouble for my lecture on pure speech than anything else I have ever done in the classroom. Ironically, it's for the stuff I say during the pure speech part. Ironically, it's for telling you about the cases. For example, Cohen versus California. This guy's walking through the LA County Courthouse in 1971. He's wearing a jacket, denim jacket. On the back of the jacket, in great big words, with a magic marker, he has written the words, "Fuck the draft." Some lady is there to, everybody okay? So lady was there with her kids. She sees the jacket. She calls the police officer over. The police officer asks him to remove the jacket. He refuses to do so. And so the officer writes him a ticket for public profanity. Even though he wasn't swearing, he was just had it written on his jacket. And so he appeals his conviction all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in Cohen versus California, the Supreme Court says, look, you can say anything you want to say. You can write down anything you want to say. One man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. In other words, there are no illegal words. There are no words that are illegal to say or write down. right? Like he whose name shall not be mentioned. That kind of a thing. There's none of that. Now, the reason I got in trouble is because I just did that, just as I did right there. And it had these two old blue hairs from Louisiana taking my class. And as soon as they heard the offensive four-letter word, draft, they went running to the dean's office, and then not here, at North Harris College, where the N stands for knowledge. And the dean comes running to my office. What are you saying in class? I got these old ladies. They're all upset. Blah, blah, blah. I was covering Cohen. Did you use the word fuck in class? I was like, oh, fuck, no. I never fucking do that. That's pretty fucking offensive. So it's like, well, why? Well, I was covering Cohen versus California. This is an important precedent that established basically the ground-based rules for free speech in this country, pure speech in this country, that you can say anything you want to say, but you can't necessarily say it anywhere you want to say it, that kind of thing. And she's like, well, could you do the lecture without mentioning the F word? Well, yeah, I could. Yeah, this guy's walking through the LA County Courthouse. He has something written on the back of his jacket which offends a lady so badly that she calls over a police officer, and the police officer asks him to remove the jacket. He takes the jacket off, is convicted of public profanity. What's the first question everybody's going to want to know? What was on the jacket? What was on the jacket? And then I have to tell them, I can't tell you. I can't tell you what's on the jacket because one person may be offended at what I say, and to protect the rights of that one person from being offended, I can't tell you the rest of it. But you can look it up online now if you want to, It's like, seriously? This is during the free speech lecture. So then she asked, well, maybe, do you have to cover the case? Just don't cover the case. It's like, I'm going to cover the case every fucking time I want to. You can't start telling me what I can or cannot cover in my classes, especially when it's directly relevant to what we're talking about. If I was covering, an episode of Community or something like that, then that's something that you got a legitimate complaint about, right? Okay. So that's one of the two times I've gotten in serious trouble. The other time, also going along with this as well. Anybody know who or what is the mascot for the University of South Carolina? Gamecocks. That's right. Somebody has a phone call. The Gamecocks. What is who is or what is the mascot for the University of Nebraska? Cornhuskers. Except they don't call themselves Cornhuskers anymore, do they? They just go with Huskers. Guess what? South Carolina, they don't call themselves the Gamecocks. They just call themselves the Cocks. Seriously. I had a friend of mine attending graduate school at the University of South Carolina back in the 80s. And South Carolina is arguably the most conservative state in the country. Bless their hearts. And he was shocked at when he went to the bookstore and he saw all of the t-shirts and all of the sweatshirts and all of the pennants and all of the notebooks and everything. You know what they had emblazoned all over the place? Great big giant letters. Go Cocks. Our Cocks are the best. Or my favorite, nobody can beat our Cocks. On everything. He saw little old ladies in their 80s walking to the football game with a shirt that says, "You can't lick our cocks." And the juxtaposition of something so obviously offensive in the most conservative state of the country made his head explode. He just stood there one eye went one way, one eye went the other way. Like, what? The land of Pat Robertson, you got cock everywhere. Every permutation of cock, any possible way you could work it in. They've got it on their signs, they've got it on their clothes, just incredible. Now, when I told that story, just like that, once again at North Harris College, somebody went to complain to the dean again. And the dean came in and wanted to know, what the hell was going on in my class now? I said, well, I was just talking about the University of South Carolina. So it was content relevant. Yes, it was. Well, okay, but she was talking like she might file a sexual harassment complaint against you. It's like, file a sexual harassment complaint against the University of South Carolina? I'm just the messenger, okay? I'm not the one that wrote that shit, okay? I'm not the one that put it out there. I'm not saying go buy that kind of thing. But this was in the 90s when political correctness was kind of, the arrow went too far in the direction of it. One of the funniest stories out of there was about this time at Penn State, where I had a friend teaching at Penn State. There was a student who took an art history class. She became unhappy because the art instructor made her buy an art book. And then when she opened up the art book with all these great paintings and stuff through history, oh my God, there were nude pictures of women in there. All over the place. As shocking as it may seem. And so she filed a sexual harassment complaint against the professor for making her buy the book with all the nudies in it, arguing that it was a form of sexual harassment. Of course, as soon as she did this, she instantly became the least popular person in the history of Penn State University. Everybody hated her. It's like, come on, it's art history. It's not Hustler. Okay? I think it's pornographic. And so she couldn't get anybody on her side. Literally nobody thought that she was on the right side on this issue. So in a sense of desperation, she took the book and photocopied the nude pictures and then stood out at the Commons and handed out the nude pictures to people. And 2 people filed a sexual harassment complaint against her for handing out nude pictures at the Commons. You have to wonder if at that point the light bulb went on in her head. Like, oh, right. If it's not okay for him to do it, it's not okay for me to do it. And if it's okay for me to do it, it's okay for him to do it. Never mind, of course, the whole copyright thing that you're, copying pictures out of a textbook. We'll let that one go on top of that, right? So in any case, just, okay. So, while there's no law that tells you what can or cannot be on a t-shirt, what can or cannot be on a jacket. I mean, if you ever get the chance to go to the Pearl Street Mall in Boulder, Colorado, you will see shirts with stuff on there that you will never see anywhere else in the English world. And I had about half a dozen of those shirts in my arms that I decided I could never wear that one. No, probably not this one either. Okay, no. And I gave them all up except for one, which in really small, little tiny print said, you're a what is there? It is curious bastard or something like that kind of thing on it. I thought it was funny. The one, though, that I wish I had hung on to, and I kick myself for this every time, is the one that said, "What the fuck are you looking at? Dick nose." With fucking dick nose like this big on the t-shirt. I should have got that. Just to show in class, not to wear, necessarily. Although that would be cool to wear that at Sturgis and see what happens, I suppose. It's called early retirement. Disability. Okay, so So if like the LaRouche people, now what the government can do is they can't restrict what you can say, but they can restrict where you can say it. For example, public property is considered a public forum, but not all public property. For example, if the LaRouche idiots want to hand out their bullshit here at the U of H campus, we have to let them. But we don't have to let them in the buildings. We don't have to let them in the buildings. We can even designate certain areas like the PGH building as a bullshit zone, which is only appropriate since that's where the political science department is headquartered. So, you know. So we can like say you can hand out the stuff over there, but you can't hand out the stuff here between social work and Arnold Hall. You can't do it here, but you can do it over there, and that's okay. Shopping malls are not public property, though, and so any private property, Rice University is considered private property. If the Rouge disciples want to hand out their bullshit at Rice, they can't. Rice is not compelled to let them. But if they want to hand it out here, we have to let them. If they want to hand it out at the airport, they have to let them, but they can designate certain areas where they can hand out their bullshit. They can't just hand it out anywhere they want to. Okay. Speech plus conduct. Basically, protest, marches, and demonstrations. Pretty easy rule here. Whatever rules you have on who can march must be content neutral. That means that the rules have to apply to everybody. Whether it's a pro-war rally, whether it's an anti-war rally, a pro-gay rights rally, or an anti-gay rights rally, like those idiots from Topeka. That everybody has to be treated the same, no matter what it is they're saying, no matter what the content of their speech is, and there's that, therefore, the content neutral. The big case here came out of Skokie, Illinois, a Jewish suburb of Chicago, where the American Nazi Party wanted to march back in the 1970s. At that time, Gerhard Lauch was the guy who was the self-professed head of the American Nazi Party, and I met him. That we lived in the same town. I had a radio show on this public radio station, and so did he. And so it's like, hey, how you doing? So, okay, I'll work on that. That has potential. And so, in recent cases involve pro-life protesters having to stay 100 feet away from clinics, or city ordinances which prohibit vigils in private neighborhoods after dark or on weekends. All of these so far have been held to be reasonable. There's an interesting case before the court now regarding the anti-gay rights folks who go to the funerals of servicemen and claim that these servicemen are being killed because of our tolerance of gay people. That it's God's wrath. You know, is it really wrath when you lose 2 or 3 guys a month? That's not wrath, is it? Isn't wrath like losing 100,000 people a day? That seems like wrath to me. Wrath seems like a little harsh. Okay. Symbolic speech often involves conduct designed to piss people off. Many times, no speech at all is involved. 3 cases here. U.S. versus O'Brien, 1968. Draft cards cannot be burned. Funny story. During the very early anti-war protests in the 1960s, like 1965, men would often burn their draft notice in a bonfire at an anti-war rally. It was a misdemeanor. They still had to serve, even though the paper was burned. But when the papers started to cover this, and Congress discovered that these guys were burning their draft notices, they made it a felony to burn a draft notice, punishable by up to 2 years in a federal minimum security facility. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with how federal minimum security facilities work, most of them have tennis courts and golf courses. They don't even have fences. They have a line on a sidewalk that you're not allowed to cross. And if you cross it, you are told to get back on the other side of the line. They're not even locked into their dorms at night, unless there's been problems. And they get to go to school for free. They get free health care. and they get to play golf and tennis during their recreation times. And so, you just got the notice that you're going to go to Vietnam and you're not very happy about it. And so your option is to simply suck it up and report for duty. And you're going to spend the next 2 years in the shit in Vietnam. Or you burn the draft notice, confess, get it on tape. Okay, you don't have tape in the 65. Get it on film. And then take it to the DA or local U.S. Attorney office and turn yourself in. And you're going to spend the next 2 years at a federal minimum security penitentiary. Finishing your school. Learning how to play tennis. Yeah. What do you suppose happened to the number of men burning their draft notices after Congress made it a felony? Right, it skyrocketed. So by 1968, the Supreme Court's taken up the issue. Can Congress do it? Or is the burning of a draft notice a protected form of political expression? And the court ruled it's illegal. You cannot burn your draft notice. The reason it's not protected is because the draft notice is government property. Yeah, I know it's not worth much money, but they said, look, if does Congress have the right to pass a law protecting federal property? Sure, they do. Is a draft notice federal property? Yes, it is. So guess what? Congress's right to protect federal property outweighs your right to burn it in protest. Now again, this was not a unanimous decision. Very few of these decisions I talk about here are unanimous. Okay? There is a pretty good dissent on this one, by the way. Myself, I'm just trying to figure this one out myself. But it's a little bit like the dollar bills that you have in your pocket. These technically don't belong to you. They're in your possession, but this is federal property. This is federal property. That's why you're not allowed to, mark on it and do other stuff to it, or you're not allowed to mar it in a way that makes it look like it's worth more than $10, kind of a thing. Whatever. Should I had a 10? I had no idea. Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969. This girl and her brother, who looks disturbingly like Dexter, came up with this idea of how to extend their Christmas holiday. Over Christmas, they decide we're going to wear black armbands to school with peace signs on them to show our support for the POWs and MIAs in Vietnam. The other kids heard about it because kids talk. And so they go to school wearing the black armbands. And the principal meets them at the door and says, unless you take off the armband, you are not going to be allowed back in school. And the kids are like, okay, let me get this straight. If I take off the armband, I have to go to school and start doing schoolwork. Or I keep the armband on and I get to go back home and play with all the really cool stuff I got for Christmas. Decisions. And so they decided not to take off the armbands. They were suspended from school. They take their case to the United States Supreme Court. And in Tinker versus Des Moines, the Supreme Court said, you can't make the kids take off their armbands. If the kids want to wear the armbands, they can wear the armbands. So they got over the junior high administrators, which are the lowest form of administrative life on the planet, by the way. And that had to have been a pretty good feeling, as it turns out. I myself was in junior high about this time, and I decided I wanted a few days off. So me and a few other folks wore some black armbands to school, but we grew up in a college town. And so everybody was like, hey, right on. Damn it. My teachers are all hippies. Felt like Cartman. Johnson versus Texas, 1989. And again, I actually talked to somebody interviewed somebody who was actually witness to this. Okay, we were on a date. But in any case, what happens is this guy Johnson is the self-appointed head of the American Communist Party, not Professor Bazanko. We're buds. So they're in Dallas in 1984, and they're protesting the Republican National Convention, and they're holding a spontaneous march with all 16 communists in America assembled to show their might. You know, being a communist in America is just a little bit like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet and deciding, today is the day I start my diet. Just in any case. I like that one. So, that nobody's paying attention to him. There's only like 12 or 13 people walking down the street shouting socialist slogans. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody's paying attention to him. So he came to this building where a flag was up on the pole, and so he pulled the flag down, said some rather nasty things, and then attempted to burn the flag. Because as it turns out, the flag was nylon. And so when he put his lighter to the flag, it did not so much burn as it melted. And so what they did is they put the flag on the ground, and then they broke open one of these big lighters and was trying to empty the lighter fluid on it and stuff. And they got the lighter fluid to light for a second, and then gone. So you got these brown spots in the flag and stuff, and so they're trying to fold it over like that's going to help somehow. And then they look up, and there's about 12 cops standing around them. It's like, good day, officer. And the cops asked them what they were doing and where did they get the flag. And so Johnson, who pulled the flag down from the flagpole, and so Johnson was arrested, charged, and convicted of desecrating a sacred national object. That in the court's majority opinion, written by Justice Brennan, I believe, the court first admonished Texas. It said, you know what, Texas? You could have charged this guy with at least a dozen offenses, as far as we can tell. Theft and destruction of private property in excess of $500 value, which is a felony. But you didn't charge him with that. You could have charged him with vagrancy, but you did not. You could have charged him with holding a parade without a permit, burning without a permit, trespass, all sorts of stuff you could have charged him with. And you didn't charge him with any of that stuff. The only thing you charged him with was desecration of a sacred national object. Now, when you look at the dictionary, what is the definition of desecration? It means to show disrespect. To desecrate something means to show disrespect for something. That the reason Johnson was convicted was not because he had burned a flag, but because he was having bad thoughts while burning the flag. Then the court goes on to point out that under the United States Flag Code, the proper disposal method for a flag that has been torn, tattered, faded, left out at night without a light on, has been soiled, touched the ground, it is to be burned. And who burns American flags more than anybody else? The American Legion. They usually burn flags, or the VFW, on Friday nights at sunset, where they play taps, they take the flag, they throw it into this fire, so, it can burn and its soul can be released to heaven. And not a single member of any of these groups has ever been convicted of burning a flag, because they're burning the flag out of patriotism. So it's not the burning of the flag, which he's been convicted of. It's burning the flag while having bad thoughts. And as incredible as it may seem, we don't think we should be throwing people in jail for having bad thoughts. That you have a right to be unpatriotic in this country. You have a right not to love this country. And then the court ended with a really profound statement. We have an interesting choice here. We get to decide what's more important, the Constitution of the United States or the symbol of the Constitution of the United States. We think the Constitution is more important than a symbol of the Constitution. 75% of Americans disagreed. And every year around the 4th of July, the Republicans try to get a flag-burning amendment added to the Constitution to outlaw flag burning. Because, yes, that's what's wrong with the country today. Too damn many flags being burned. Yep, that's the problem. That's the issue. So Congress followed in U.S. versus Eichmann. Congress had passed a law to outlaw flag burning, and the court's response was, didn't you read Texas versus Johnson? That you can't throw people in jail for doing something for having bad thoughts. That it preserved the right to burn a flag out of respect, but you could not. And what is actually considered patriotic or not patriotic to do with an American flag has changed over the years. Back in the 60s, people got arrested for having a flag patch on their ass. But Barbara Bush attended the 1992 Republican Convention with an American flag handkerchief. And that was okay. It was okay for her to blow her nose in the flag, apparently. But to wear it as a patch was considered unconstitutional. Now it's constitutional. Not constitutional. Now it's patriotic. If you got a flag on your truck and it's all covered with mud and shit, then you're a patriot. Back in the 60s, you get shot for shit like that. Which is an appropriate segue to the other First Amendment, the religious clauses. By the way, I was writing the notes when I was thinking of getting a Harley from a friend of mine for about the same price as a new Segway. I was trying to figure out which one I want. That the Harley says I'm cool, the Segway says I'm too lazy to walk in from the parking lot. Could go either way. The religious clauses are supposed to work in tandem by prohibiting an establishment of religion. The free exercise of religion is protected. Countries that adopt or promote one religion or one set of religions do so at the expense of others. This idiot, for example, will tell you that, he'll tell you, many people came to America because they were being persecuted back in their home countries. And so they came to America so they could exercise religious freedom. He's absolutely right. That absolutely happened. You had a lot of people coming to America in the 1600s because they were being persecuted back home. The Puritans, the Quakers, the Amish, the Mennonites, all these people came over here because they were being persecuted. But what Pat Robertson doesn't tell you is, why were they being persecuted? And the reason is because they were not members of the official church back where they came from. And because they were not members of the official church, the government was harassing them, denying them their right to worship, even locking them up. And so that's why they fled Europe, was to gain religious liberty. And the reason they didn't have religious liberty back home is because their home governments all had official religions. And they were not members of those religions. And so the idea that the Founding Fathers got, that a lot of people like Pat Robertson don't get even today, is the fact that the two are intertwined with one another. That as soon as the government takes sides in a religious argument, the other side, whatever it is, will suffer from that. It's inevitable. It has happened without fail in every country, in every state government. State governments had official religions till the 1840s. People who were not members of that official religion were treated worse than people who were members of the official religion. So the Founding Fathers got this. They understood that if the federal government stays neutral in all religious matters, if the federal government just stays the hell out of it, everybody is on a level playing field. Now the thing is, Pat Robertson doesn't want a level playing field. He wants the playing field tilted for him. He says, look, all the Establishment Clause means is that the United States government cannot pick a specific religion, like Catholicism or Lutheranism. But it does not prohibit the United States government from adopting Christianity in general and Christian principles in general and spreading those and encouraging people to be Christians. Really? That's what that means? So here's the question. If the Founding Fathers intended America to be a Christian nation, using our political institutions to promote Christianity and Christian beliefs, and they wanted to make sure that all of our leaders were going to be Christians, then why is this in the Constitution? Article 6, Section 3. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Why is that there? Why is that there? If the founders intended for Christians to have a political monopoly in this country and to use their majority status in this country to promote their values over the values of other religions, why is that in the Constitution? Why is that in there? It's because the founders didn't intend to establish this as a Christian enclave. The vast majority of people that came to America did not come here for religious liberty. The vast majority of people came over here to make money. Some of them did. Others came over here to help the other people make money. They were called slaves. The Confederate Constitution also had this prohibition as well. So enough preaching, let's get to the cases. One case real fast. Reynolds versus the United States, 1878. The Mormons had fled the United States and moved to Mexico. Well, Mexico territory. Specifically an area called Utah. So that they could practice polygamy. But then the Spanish-American War occurs. The United States gets Utah, Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas. And now Utah's back in the United States. Oh, damn it. And Congress passes a law outlawing polygamy in any of the territories. The Mormons challenged this, saying, look, we sincerely believe that it's perfectly okay, and in fact it's perfectly moral, for a man to be married to several women at the same time. There's also a practical part of this as well, since a lot of men died moving out to Utah, that most of the people that survived were women. There's a practical issue. There's a lot of women and not a lot of guys. That kind of a thing. But the belief in polygamy predates their moving out west. So we should be able to practice our religion as we see fit. And the Supreme Court said, no. You can believe anything you want to believe, but you cannot practice anything you want to practice. It's okay for you to believe polygamy is moral. We can't stop you. But we can stop you from practicing polygamy. Well, here's the thing. From a Freudian viewpoint, I think it's really interesting that when the 9 men on the Supreme Court were confronted with the idea of one man being married to several women at the same time, and they were looking for an analogy, human sacrifice came to their mind. They said, look, what if somebody believed in human sacrifice? Should we allow them to practice human sacrifice simply because they believe in it? Of course not. That the government has the right to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. So in other words, the people on the Supreme Court were sitting there going, wow, 6 wives. What would that be like? Being hit by a train? No. Shot by Indians? No. Falling off a cliff? No. Burned at the stake? No. The smoke knocks you out. I got it. Human sacrifice. That's what it would be like. It would be like having 6 people holding you down on an altar, and then they tear out your organs slowly and painfully as you scream bloody murder. That's what it would be like to have 6 wives. Just imagine the hell of it. Wherever you go with your wives, you have 6 people telling you where to go, how to drive, look out for this, that kind of a thing. And then when you consider that women who live together tend to cycle together, oh, God. It's kind of like whenever gay marriage comes up and some conservatives say, well, if guys can marry other guys and gals can marry other gals, why can't we marry animals? It's like, dude, why did you go there? What exactly is it in your mind that makes you, but there is an answer to that, by the way. The answer is, the reason it's not okay to marry an animal is because an animal cannot enter into a contract. Right? Right? That's why. That's why you cannot legalize horse-man marriages. Like the guy in South Carolina, twice convicted of having sex with a horse. The same horse. It's apparently a good-looking horse. So we'll come back.